let's talk a little bit about how BreadTube defines fascism.
Sure. Well, among Marxists, you generally have three definitions of fascism. The first definition is that fascism is, conservative, extreme right wingers. Basically, Republicans get more conservative, more authoritarian, they become fascists. And then generally that's the justification for voting for the Democrats, because at least they're not fascists, right? That's the first one. That's pretty standard. You get that from Social Democrats, from the Communist Party, and some others, right? Then the second definition comes from Trotskyites, and they generally argue that fascism is a mass movement of the middle class that is against big corporations, but also against the labor movement and the working class. And then the third definition is kind of a strange one. It comes out of, some of the Maoists use it. It was used in the early 1930s by the communists, where they say fascism is like, it's like a capitalist attempt to imitate socialism. It's social fascism, right? But all three of those definitions really don't get to the essence of what fascism is. Fascism is basically when there is a capitalist economic crisis. The capitalists, one faction of the capitalists, will take control of the state and utilize it to try and solve the economic crisis with mass destruction, violence, and terror. And it is an outgrowth of capitalism and an economic system, right? Germany, economic crisis, communist uprisings going on. So, Krupp and Tyson and a banker named Hallemer Schacht, they met with Hitler and they said, "You're our guy." And they put Hitler in power, and he put half the country in concentration camps and half the country in military uniforms. And he refused to pay back the debts to the Americans, and he stabilized the economy for a few years. And then they had to have World War II in order to keep the war machine rolling ahead. And the rest is history. Italian fascism is a similar story. In Chile, you had Pinochet come in, and that fascism is about one faction of the ruling class seizing power and engaging in mass terror and destruction to try and stave off an economic crisis. And the best understanding of fascism that I've ever heard comes from R. Palm Dutt. R. Palm Dutt was a leader of the British Communist Party in the 1930s. He wrote a very, very important book called Fascism and Social Revolution, published in 1934. But you can also read the writings of Georgy Dimitrov, who was the leader of the Communist International. And he was somebody who the Nazis had arrested and charged him with burning the Reichstag, and he was able to do his own defense in the court and was eventually freed and returned to the Soviet Union. It's kind of a miracle. I mean, he was a real anti-fascist hero. He was the leader of Bulgaria after the Second World War. Georgy Dimitrov, and he talked about fascism in this sense as well. You can read the writings of many of the great anti-fascist fighters in the 1930s, folks who fought in Spain against Franco and all of that. This is how they understood fascism. Fascism was an outgrowth of capitalism in decay, and that the ideology it doesn't matter. It's not about, fascism isn't about what you say, it's about what you do, right? Mussolini, he had this like weird sci-fi futurist thing, but what did he do when he came into power? Mass destruction and terror to stabilize capitalism. Hitler, it was all about knights and castles and Germans and anti-Semitism and Wagner, but what did he do when he came in? Mass violence and terror in an attempt to stabilize capitalism. Fascism sounds different everywhere. It always has a different kind of thing, but fascism is about what you do. It's not about what you say. And there are instances where fascists sound like they might be communists. I don't know. You may have seen, there's an old episode of Superman where Superman has a bit of a problem because there's this bad guy who puts on a Superman costume and is going around doing all these bad things. And Superman is like, oh my God, what am I going to do? But the thing is, that guy might wear the Superman costume, but what he does is the exact opposite of what Superman does. Fascists might talk against big corporations. Fascists might sound like they're against the system. They might call for a revolution. But what they do is engage in mass violence and terror and destruction in order to stabilize capitalism. That's the essence of fascism. And the BreadTube crowd has made fascism into an aesthetic. Fascism is a type of clothes people wear. It's a tone of voice people use. And it has nothing to do with this scientific Marxist understanding of what fascism actually is. And they make it all about the window dressing, all about the symbols, all about the hand gestures, and not about the essence of what fascism is.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because I think in this BreadTube crowd, a fascist is an individual. It's an individual working class person who maybe doesn't know everything about trans people, maybe accidentally misgenders someone, maybe is a conservative libertarian, and that's kind of what they see fascism is.
I've noticed among a lot of liberals, especially since Trump took office, this narrative has gone out that the problem is that there is this vast secret Nazi conspiracy that has infiltrated the American government. And our job as good liberals and leftists is to help the good capitalists like Biden purge this vast secret Nazi conspiracy from the government, and then everything will be okay. Well, first of all, I don't think that there's necessarily a vast Nazi conspiracy. I think some capitalists like Betsy DeVos and like Bernie Marcus and like Trump and the frackers are using people with alt-right perspectives as their foot soldiers, number one. But number two, even if there was a vast purge and every right-wing person was taken out of the government, it wouldn't resolve all the problems of capitalism, right?
Exactly.
The problem is not this vast crypto-Nazi secret plot, the problem is capitalism. And that, oddly, this kind of weird conspiracy theory, I know Spike Lee pushed it in his movie Black Klansman, which I liked. It was a good movie, but that was kind of the message you got from it. It kind of mimics anti-Semitism, right? Because what is anti-Semitism? It's the idea, well, there's not a problem with capitalism or imperialism. The problem is just the Jews. And if we just get rid of the Jews, we purge out the Jews, everything will be okay. Well, it's not scientific, right? And this narrative that there's just this vast, secret alt-right plot, I criticize specifically in the book ContraPoint's video, How to Spot a Fascist, because I like ContraPoint. She's probably the best and most articulate BreadTube voice. She's probably the only one that seems to actually, take the job of deprogramming the alt-right seriously and actually try to find out what these people believe and counter it. But her video, How to Spot a Fascist, it's beneath her. She could do better than that. And the whole video is about how basically there's a group of people that have a very, very specific worldview, and that would be like Richard Spencer, white nationalist kind of people. And that there is a whole bunch of secret, people like that within the government and on the internet. And here's all the secret code signs to look for, and you can find them. And it almost sounds like the John Birch Society. You remember there was a bunch of secret communists taking over the government, and and it was just kind of bizarre. There are millions of Americans that are confused. Millions of Americans voted for Donald Trump. Not all of them are part of this secret, vast white nationalist conspiracy plot. A lot of them are just taken in by right-wing ideas. And if your response to all of them is to shout, Nazi, Nazi, you're not going to win any of them over. You're not going to be very effective at the end of the day. And I also noticed there's a huge double standard. Joe Biden has made an endless amount of racial gaffes, but nobody claims that Vosh is a secret Nazi for urging people to vote for Joe Biden. I never. The same for a lot of Democrats, right? Hillary Clinton even talked about super predators and such.
Absolutely.
And somehow this weird conspiracy theory, it's like the Da Vinci Code or something, right? We're going to piece together the secret signs and find out who is part of the vast fascist Illuminati cabal. It's like, this isn't politics. This is silliness almost.
It's theater. It's, the way that I always kind of thought of it, and that you said, DeVos, Trump, the frackers, they're benefiting from this. Capital is laughing its way to the bank. It's the barbarians fighting each other. I always compared, around 2016, Trump, using people of color or immigrants or whomever as a scapegoat for rural white working class people, like a modern day Bacon's rebellion of this psychological wage imparted on a specific group, and then working to divide the working class while everybody's just benefiting from this. And leftists and BreadTubers subscribing to this narrative is so harmful because it's doing the same thing.
It's extremely dangerous. If you say that the pie can only be this big, the only way your slice gets any bigger is if you cut into somebody else's slice, right? That's the only way, if the pie can only be this big. And no one ever thinks that their slice of the pie is big enough, right? There's an old device they called a whipsaw. It's very archaic. We don't use that anymore. But it was a saw that had two handles on it. And when one guy was pushing, the other guy was pulling. When the other guy was pulling, the other guy was pushing, right? It was a whipsaw. And really, in a time like this, that's kind of what they're doing. They've convinced one section of the population that they can only gain at the expense of the other section. They've convinced the other section that they can only gain at the expense of the other section. And basically, we're pushing and pulling on each other while the capitalists sit back there and laugh. And at the end of the day, if you declare the pie to only be this big, you're trapped. Marxism says the pie can be unlimited if we just get beyond the irrationality of profits, right? That there is no limit to human growth and creativity. There's a limit to the irrational system of production for profits, right? And if we can get beyond that, there is no real limit to human creativity and growth.
And that is an optimism that you don't generally see within, I mean, just the left as a whole nowadays, but particularly in BreadTube, because it's kind of committed to inculcating that kind of ideology ultimately. You see them beating people over the head with their own consumption, saying you need to change what you're consuming, you need to change what you're doing with your own life, as if demand just straightforwardly influences supply. That's not how things work. We know that they don't work the way that Thomas Malthus, for instance, said how they work. You did a ton of really good work on Malthus in this book, and on Margaret Sanger as well.
Sure. Well, Margaret Sanger was a Marxist. She was wealthy. She was one of the main financial backers of the Socialist Party and the industrial workers of the world in New York City. But, her main thing was that she was into sexual freedom, that she believed in sexual freedom. And communists and socialists, they believed in that. And she fled the country, actually, based on, being charged for sending birth control through the mail and such. And she got to Britain. The Soviet Union, they had a socialist revolution. She went to the Soviet Union, and it wasn't the free love, free sex paradise she wanted it to be. And she made friends with the Rockefellers and the Neo-Malthusian Society, and they agreed to pay for her promotion of birth control. And on that basis, she went from Marxism to Malthusianism. During the Great Depression, communists were leading protests demanding food and bread and jobs and housing. She was saying that the Great Depression happened because there's too many people in the world because of the cruelty of charity. And she was hanging out with the Ku Klux Klan and other kind of folks and talking about the need to reduce the human population and saying some pretty explicitly racist things. And that, again, this is about economics, right? At the end of the day, it's not simply about libidinal release. It's not about getting your rage out. It's not about fulfilling your sexual desires. It's about constructing a rationally organized economy. But if you take the economics out of it and you turn it into just this adolescent desire to get your rage and sexual tension out, it turns into something rather destructive. And I talk about the prevalence of occultism in kind of left-wing circles has a similar thing. Aleister Crowley, Marilyn Ferguson, some of these folks, their focus is not on making the world better. It's about having some kind of Armageddon apocalyptic explosion to make everything into balance. And that's the final chapter of the book talks about that.
As we were reading this, we were making a joke of with Margaret Sanger's quotes and how just I didn't even know this about the KKK and how explicitly racist. I mean, obviously Malthusianism is inherently racist in itself, but just how vocal she was about this. And so we were joking how fast is it going to be until a BreadTuber actually reads this and takes those quotes of Margaret Sanger.
We do not want the word to go out that we want to exterminate the N-word population.
And says, yeah, Caleb Maupin said this.
Caleb Maupin says this in BreadTube Serves Imperialism. You can find the quote.
Yeah. I mean, that's Margaret Sanger, and that's about as honest. I have not yet heard one honest critique of the book from a BreadTuber.
Well, it's all been the secret CIA plot to murder communists. We've seen people saying he claims that BreadTubers want to murder him, or he claims that BreadTube is a tool. It's no, that is not said in the book. It's the type of rhetoric that is used by BreadTubers does put communists in an unfavorable light, and with the type of action that the BreadTubers actually push, which is a lot of this anti-fascist action, which is ultimately violence against the Proud Boys, getting in violent conflicts against various gangs on the right. That's eventually going to spill over to communists because they continually label communists as fascists.
And supporting the police state explicitly.
Yeah,
there are Antifa people doing that.
And that's one thing I said in the book, which is that, BreadTube is a little bit more dangerous than some of these fake socialist trends of the past because, usually the attitude of these fake socialist trends would be, their attitude would be basically they would be trying to tone down revolutionary activism. Don't occupy your factory, just vote for the Democrats, whatever. BreadTube is doing the exact opposite, right? They are trying to escalate an armed confrontation with the alt-right at a time when the right wing has a much bigger base among the population.
Right.
It's like, and basically, if they are able to pull this off, they are able to kind of mobilize for mass violence in the streets between right wingers and left wingers, the result will be one of two things. One being a huge crackdown on all political activism and all speech by the state in order to stabilize things, or two, an outright victory for the right wing. Neither of those are desirable, right? BreadTube is not going to be able to make the revolution by going out and punching it out or shooting it out with the Proud Boys, okay?
Imagine Skippy the Bear trying to fight right wingers with a gun, you know?
Yeah, I mean, what we need now more than ever is ideological education. We need average Americans to understand socialism, to understand that socialism is not everyone taking all their money and giving it to somebody else. Socialism is about organizing the economy to put people first. I've used the slogan that we need a government of action that will fight for working families. That's the slogan that we've used at the Center for Political Innovation. Imagine, a government that took action to help the people, whether it was with healthcare, jobs, and education, a government that actually swung into action. You guys are parents, and you know that if your kids were going to school without proper clothes on or something, you could go to jail. That's criminal neglect, right? Well, I maintain that the government of the United States is guilty of criminal neglect. People are drinking water that's not properly purified. The power grids are exploding. They're wasting all the money on wars and bombs and tanks and drones in other countries while people are hungry here in the United States. And I maintain the government is guilty of neglect. And what we need is a government of action that will fight for working families, that will, instead of declaring war on China or Russia or Cuba or Venezuela, will declare war on hunger and homelessness and student debt. Right? That's what we need in the United States more than ever. And that's the message we need to get to people. We need to get people to understand that the global struggle against imperialism and the struggle to improve their lives are linked, right? That the people around the world struggling against imperialism and the people within the United States struggling for economic justice have the same enemy, which is the imperialist Wall Street monopolies.
Exactly. And Marxists often get a very bad rap as pessimists, because we're attempting to show that this is all a big connected problem. It's much, much larger than any one discrete, we need to fight racism because racism is a thing. Yes, we do, but it's part of a much larger thing. Now, what we ultimately get is then people saying, it's very pessimist. But you're an optimistic person. This is an optimistic message. You're saying, hey, we need to actually do something that improves people's lives. We need to work with that as our primary goal. And that's really... I think that as much as they might try to paint this book as you saying there's a CIA conspiracy to kill communists, it's really you saying look, here is the actual ideological obstacle in order for us to actually maintain analysis as to what the actual problems of today are. And to round this out, your CPI, the think tank that you founded, could you give us a little bit of your vision there and tell us what you intend to be doing over the next few years with that?
Absolutely. And actually, I'm trying to build a think tank because every day, practically, I get approached by another young person, usually someone in their late teens, early 20s, who has seen my streams and says, I believe in what you're doing. I want to do something. I actually want to do something. I want to take action. I don't just want to sit on the internet and feel bad about all this stuff. I want to do something. And I'll tell you, the most rewarding experience is being part of a community of people who are committed to changing the world and realizing that you're not alone. And one of the most dangerous things about BreadTube, I feel, is that it's very isolated. People sit there and they watch the videos on BreadTube and they feel like the world is so bad and they feel hopeless. But socialism is fundamentally optimistic, right? You listen to the songs that people sang as they were, industrializing the USSR. You listen to the songs of the Cuban people, and you listen to some of these older folks. There's a great, PBS documentary that interviews some of the older folks who were around at the time the USSR was industrializing, and they describe this feeling of community that comes from being part of a mission to make the world a better place, and that what we need more than anything is not, individualism, isolation, and pessimism. We need a community of solidarity, and that's what the CPI is about trying to build, a community of solidarity dedicated to spreading a socialist message. It's not a party. It's not a political group. We're not going around engaging in protests or activism. We are going around bringing people the revolutionary message. We are spreading the truth and light of Marxism. And people are ready for this. I mean, the country is hungry for this. We need hope more than anything. We need hope and optimism in order to get a real solution. So that's what I'm all about. So there you go. And thank you for having me on.
No, thank you for
Absolutely.
coming on. The book is BreadTube Serves Imperialism. It'll be in the show notes. We'll link to it. It's available on Amazon. I would highly recommend it. Like in terms of what the title implies it is about and the actual scope of the book, it is so much more deep. It's not all just like talking about how Vosh, sucks.
Not a Twitter thread. Not a Twitter
No,
thread.
it's not a Twitter thread. It's not you doing call out culture on BreadTube.
It reads very much like a Marxist text and describing the state of like this new leftist communism and like how dire it is, but then ending on this very positive, what can we actually do?
Again,
Yeah.
thank you so much for your time,
Yes,
Caleb. This was
absolutely.
fantastic. Let's do it again sometime.
Talk to you soon.
All right.
Thanks
Have a
again.
good one.
Bye-bye.
Bye.